If you don't stop beating your ass, I'll send you to Martha's Vineyard. Okay, we're recording. Oh, hey everybody. Welcome back to JL's Book Club, where we don't talk about Fight Club because I didn't read Fight Club. This week, we are reviewing Wilmington's Lie, a Pulitzer Prize winning account of one comedian being told his special would be ready and it not being ready for a year. Oh no, I'm sorry, that's the memoir I'm working on. This is Wilmington's Lie, the murderous coup of 1898 and the rise of white supremacy. Sounds pretty woke and CRT. Uh-oh. It did win the Pulitzer Prize in 2021, but you know, the Pulitzer Prizes are notoriously left-leaning and critical racy. But before we discuss the book, obviously we have a new beverage sponsor this week, Seltzer. It's like water, but a lot shittier. Seltzer. So, my brother lent me Wilmington's Lie. He had talked it up, and he read it, and when we went out to lunch for my birthday, he handed it to me and said, I think you should read this. And I said, well, I only have 75 other books that I haven't read yet that I own, but sure, let's push those back on the priority list. But my brother is a circumspect, smart person, and when he recommends something, it's worth... my brother, as a little background, when I was laid off in 2009 during the recession, though my layoff was specifically pre-recession, it was just my incompetency as a lawyer, but I tell people, 2009, the economy, but mine was strictly merit-based layoff. He said to me, if you're going to pursue comedy full-time, you should move to LA. Because you won't be comfortable there, you don't have connections or friends, so you'll be laser focused by necessity. I didn't follow his advice. I stayed where I was comfortable because I could rationalize staying in New York for comedy because it's a thriving comedy scene. And a mere 13 years later, I'm doing book reviews for 14 people on a Patreon. So once again, if you get anything out of this book review that has nothing to do with the book, it's listen to my brother's advice when he gives it. So, he told me to read Wilmington's Lie, and I did. And fortunately, due to a slow week at the day job, I was able to crank out about 80 pages a day sitting at my desk like a homicide detective waiting for a call that never comes, which in the homicide detective world is a good thing when your phone doesn't ring, because it means homicides are not occurring, or at least not being reported. Either way, your job is easier. Whether there's death or not, it's really just the phone ringing that's your problem. So, this book is about Wilmington, North Carolina, where I was booked to perform early this year, and then that gig got canceled due to COVID. And they said they would reschedule me as soon as possible. I still haven't been rescheduled at the Wilmington Comedy Zone. So, Wilmington's Lie 2, JL's comedy career. But this is the first Wilmington's Lie. It's basically it starts with sort of post-Civil War, and, obviously a rough time in the South, if you're anybody, really, but especially if you're a racist white slave owner, or just a racist white, because all of a sudden black people have rights, at least on paper. And so it goes through how Wilmington, for about 2 decades after the Civil War, becomes this sort of hard-fought, like it wasn't easy, but becomes this sort of I want to say it's about a 50-50 city. Maybe I can't remember actually whether maybe the majority one way or the other. But there was a large black population and a large sort of thriving black population. This may remind people, I believe, it was 1919, the Tulsa Massacre, now immortalized in the first episode of Watchmen on HBO. But this is 20 or 21 years before that, and if you're familiar with the Tulsa Massacre, it was basically like a bunch of angry white people, probably motivated by jealousy and insecurity. All you need is one rumor of a black man touched a white woman, raped a white woman, smiled at a white woman, and that's all the impetus, white men would need in that time to basically like, oh no, that black man looked a white woman in the eye, he probably raped her. Let's destroy everything. So, but that was, a long time ago. Just imagine the January 6th coup attempt, but slightly worse. and you have it. But basically for a quarter of a century, there seems to be this growth in Wilmington where, like, black people, there's a thriving middle class. And the writer, David Zucchino, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, that's the masculine form of zucchini. He's the writer. So he covers sort of the breadth of the black community at this time. You know, you've got accommodationists who are very, like, humble and just want to keep going, and they obey all the social cues and all the, like, they let white people be the dominant people as long as they leave them alone and let them thrive. You have more defiant black people, or defiant meaning want to be treated as full citizens. That's what counted for defiance, I think, in that time. But what happens is, first Reconstruction ends, okay? So then the South gets to basically take over again. Those Southern whites get to take over everything again. This is more of a history lesson that's covered in the book, but what happens is the Democrats, who at the time were basically the Republicans of today, the elite racists, and the Democrats become too cozy with business, and all of a sudden, working class whites start to form political coalitions with black people who they don't respect, but they understand, hey, if I'm going to, this is the difference between 1880s whites and 2020 whites in terms of the conservative party, if you will. Today's angry racist whites are willing to fuck themselves over in the name of their bigotry, whereas at least in the 1880s they were like, I don't like the blacks, but I also want to eat. So I guess, and they call it the Fusionist Coalition, which was basically whites whose self-preservation was greater than their racism joining with blacks to form a majority Republican government. So Wilmington becomes this, like, fusionist haven where black people are able to at least have a relatively normal existence for the time, or a thriving existence for the time, and you have Republican politicians beating out the Democrats. So what happens in Wilmington is you have a combination of racist white soldiers returning from the Spanish-American War with weapons and training, and very bitter, angry white people in Wilmington wanting to take over. And they consider it Negro rule, that they're being dominated by Negroes, because Negroes are, in the parlance of the time, are getting to live their lives and have some political power because of a political coalition that has been formed. And so what happens is this odd mix of things that are covered in the book, which eerily similar to today. Now, what some people might say while reading this book is go, oh, okay, so this is a woke journalist sort of validating his ideas of the present and doing some sort of revisionist history. But what's interesting about the book is it came out in January of 2020, which means the writer had obviously researched and wrote it over the course of probably like 2017 to 2019, before January 6th happens, all that stuff. He does cover a lot of the gerrymandering issues that took place in North Carolina that courts struck down. But what's interesting is you read throughout the book, it's a multi-pronged attack by the Democrats of the time, who are eerily similar to the Republicans of today. And anybody who tells you that there wasn't that's the popular thing that the Dinesh D'Souza's of the world like to say, that there was no political realignment. Really? Then why did Strom Thurmond, notorious racist, lead the switch from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party after the Civil Rights Act was passed in 1964? And why has the South, which was always Democratic, become always Republican right at the moment when rights were guaranteed under law to black people? I guess that's just the weirdest coincidence in American history. But he couldn't have known January 6th was coming. So he's writing this book, and it's like eerie how you see, first it starts, okay, you have resentful white people who feel like, the Civil War in Wilmington of white people was white people who are racist, but don't prioritize that over their own success. And the white people who are like, white is the most important thing. And that's a very powerful motivation, as we've seen with the MAGA movement. But despite the 5 people wearing blacks for Trump shirts. But what starts is you start these rumors that blacks are arming themselves. You see that, and the media was very important to this, sort of conservative media, if you will, which was most, you had black newspapers and then you had every other newspaper, and it seemed most of them ranged from somewhat racist to virulent racist. And the local media, and they go into like the history of who bought the paper and what becomes this sort of feeding frenzy for the blacks are arming themselves, which wasn't true. And then speeches by various people in the South about how blacks have too much power and they need to know their place. And then what always becomes the final catalyst is the rumors of sexual assault or rape, or how the black men cannot control themselves, etc., etc. And so you have this media frenzy starting to build about armed black men. Not true, because the black men couldn't buy guns, because all the gun shops were just like, we're just selling to whites, we refuse to sell to blacks. So you already have this disadvantage growing in terms of gun ownership and ability to protect yourself. You have these trained soldiers coming back, and then you have the media just feeding this frenzy, this resentment of, oh, if 25% of our government is black, of our state government is black, or well then it's all black. So then there's this speech given by this racist woman, and I forget her name. Hopefully she's forgotten. She shouldn't be forgotten to history. What she said shouldn't be forgotten to history. Her name, who gives a shit? But she gives this very long racist speech. And so an editor of the black newspaper in town, in Wilmington, writes an editorial in rebuttal. And it was a very brave thing to do. And of course, in a country of free speech, he was totally entitled, and he was correct. Because it was this idea of, the gist of the speech was, well, some of these white women are consenting to black men. Like, you ignore the fact that most of the relationships you consider rape and assault are consensual relationships between the races. And if we're talking about rape and out of control, how about the fact that white men for decades have been the real ones out of control in terms of rape, and including, if mixing of the races is so bad, why is it okay for all these white men to have sex and rape black women? Well, you can imagine that didn't go over well. And there were calls for lynching the editor. Real calls. Like, this isn't just like vague Marjorie Taylor Greene musings. These were like, we should go down there and burn his newspaper and kill him and anybody who supports him. That becomes the match, I guess. Like, the town is already full of gasoline because of it's racist, and it's the 1890s. But that is the match. And then it becomes this strategic two-step of, and this is why it's called the murderous coup of 1898, and not just a massacre, which it was, is because then it becomes this two-step. The politically motivated people sort of say, well, if we can kind of pair this with the election of 1898, excuse me, the midterm elections, then we can both kill a bunch of black people and take over all the politics of the city, and hopefully the state at some point. And what happens is a murder of 60 plus black men, many more people dying in terms of fleeing. It is, I don't want to go into it is, to me, this is one of those books that you sort of wonder what's the point? Not for writing it, not for reading it, but is anybody in this climate going to actually read this book who needs to read it? I think everybody should read it. But you see the threads, which is what sort of one party in this country really hates. You see the threads from this coup to then, for the next 70 years, I think there was not one black congressperson from North Carolina. 70 years, 70 plus years. And it can be kind of traced to this because the state then adopted all the policies that were thriving in Wilmington. They got certain things like grandfather clauses for voting from Louisiana. And then, I mean, in the epilogue, he just goes through like ceaseless kind of examples. And then, of course, there was no Republican elected to national office from North Carolina until the 1970s. Jesse Helms. an incredible racist. And that's when it's like, oh, now they're okay with Republicans because Republicans became the party of segregation, racism, bigotry. And so my thing with reading books like this, it's like I recommend it to everybody. It's really well written. It's devastating. It makes you feel disgusted. And it connects to the present and even to the future based on when it was written, because you're reading this going, yeah, there are people willing to weaponize, there are people who are true believers in January 6th, and then there's that group of people known as most Republican members of Congress who are willing to use it for their power. And that's what you saw in Wilmington. But of course, like I said, Zucchino could not have known January 6th was going to happen. So it's not like he was writing this with like, I'm going to make this parallel to present day. He couldn't have done that because it wasn't present day yet. And so that, to me, makes the book all the more powerful, because you're like, oh, right. Many people don't want us to learn history because we will see the direct links and parallels to today. I know this wasn't a funny review. That's why I tried to do a couple jokes up front, because it's not a funny book, as you can imagine. It's the kind of book where you say, yeah, this is essential reading. But will the people who need to read it, and will even if some Republican diehard were to read it and go, that's a disgrace. But my daddy didn't come from North Carolina, and we didn't have no Jim Crow or no slaves. Okay, thanks for reading it, at least. But he interviews several descendants of participants in the coup. And I gotta say, I actually tried to put myself in their shoes. Like, if I found out my maternal great-grandfather was like, some racist murderer, I'd probably be able to just be like, well, I don't know him, fuck him. But these are people who are so steeped in a certain culture where it's like, well, my daddy was mayor of the town and you're tearing down our legacy. Because if my great-grandfather had done something heinous, I'm not linked to that in any other way other than like he is related to me by blood, but not by any tradition or history or story or legend in my town. But if you're the son of a great Confederate general and that becomes part of your family's legacy, maybe it's harder to remove yourself from that. But in almost all the interviews with descendants, it was just like this unwillingness to sort of tear them down. And that makes me think that if they were strangers, if your legacy is nothing to do with that legacy, then you probably have an easier time tearing it down. But the South is very much like, my father, Beauregard Simpson IV, was a great general. How dare you besmirch? That's why I own the general store, because my great-granddaddy was a great man. And I guess that's how the South seems to be. It's like all about like, oh, in 1842, we were the cat's pajamas in Wilmington. It's like, all right, well, it's 2022. Can you get over your fucking self already? Tear down the statue. I've been reading about some of the statues that were up of these men, and it took like battles and vandalism to take them down. And as you read this and you see, if you could show tell this story to people who are so, I don't know, maybe we should put it in a museum. You should burn this fucking shit and take a shit on what's left of the statues. That's the truth. These are horrible people. These were horrible people. Just admit you made a mistake. Bad people put up the statues, and fuck them. Like, and because you have descendants of the people who were murdered, who have to like walk around the town going like, yep, that guy shot my great-grandfather in the face for being black. Oh well. No. And I'm going to read, I just thought of one. It's an easy passage to find because it's the last paragraph. But a descendant of one of the people, one of the main people, was he the... Oh, yes, he is the 85-year-old, I want to say grandson of the newspaper editor who wrote the thing that sort of really got everything going. And that editor basically dies like in old age, but was just a shattered man. And you see these people of accomplishments who are working in Harlem and Detroit and whatnot, who leave as janitors, as different things. And you're like, these people were like lawyers and businessmen and family men. And it is an incredibly devastating book. And this is the kind of shit that should be like mandatory reading because it explains so much. But here's what the grandson the grandson, at 85, said, "I asked whether he was prepared to forgive the white men who led the riot and drove his grandfather from Wilmington 120 years earlier. Lewin thought for a moment, then said, 'I'm not a very religious person, and I don't forgive. If there's a hell, I hope they're burning in it. All of them.'" The end. I thought that was very powerful by the writer, because it was like, I've just detailed for you intergenerational just destruction. And it's a normal question to say, hey, because some people did say, I feel like I've moved on, or I've forgiven in my heart, or I just, to move on, I needed to do some sort of process for myself. But he ends with that, which I think is very powerful and meaningful, because it's basically saying, like, yeah, for some people, why should they forgive? Why this set in course generations of destruction, of poverty, of lives changed. And I think by ending with that was an incredibly powerful. So sorry to spoil it. Sorry to spoil it. It does not end on a note of forgiveness, but this is not a book about the ending. This is a book about every page should be read. So I think a long review, but I obviously feel passionate about this, and now I can return this book to my brother. But yeah, and you can tell I read it so quickly that it's not even like creased or fucked up. That's how fast I read through this. But it's, my dilemma whenever I read these books is anybody who needs to read this going to read this? And that's where schools come in, guys. That's where fucking schools come in, where you make the kids read it before their granddaddy can go, you don't need to read that filth. We ain't never had no slaves, so why they teaching CRT DeSantis 2024? So that's why we need schools to teach this. And then that's why Republicans in many states are fighting the schools, because they don't want to be taught this. Because if you can drink, hey, wait a second, my daddy was a Jesse Helms supporter, but from this book it seems that Jesse Helms was a fucking racist piece of shit. Oh no, Daddy, what do I do now? So there, I have no respect for the Republican Party, or let's bring on the Civil War. Just kidding, that's a joke. That's a joke. Okay, in case one of you 9 people watching this decides to make it public, don't do that. No, but it's an incredible book. Read it. But if you're watching me, you're probably of similar mind. So maybe you read it, and maybe if you have a piece of shit in your family, but that takes your recommendations, say, Jethro, could you read this? Okay. Could you learn to read, and then your first book after you's reading is this, because it's mighty important. We're done. Not just with the book review, but with this country. Wilmington's Lie, a fantastic book that everyone should read and won't. So, next month, double barrel shotgun of books. Midnight in Chernobyl, a New York Times top 10 book from 2019 that I have. Obviously, I've seen the show Chernobyl on HBO, one of the 5 or 10 greatest things I've ever seen on a TV screen. But this was a very well-regarded book that came out, I think, slightly before Chernobyl aired. But I've heard great things about it, so I'll be reading that for a real pick-me-up as we continue to read about governments failing their citizens. And the other one for inspiration is called Mountains Beyond Mountains, The Quest of Dr. Paul Farmer, a Man Who Would Cure the World. The reason I got this book recently, it's from 2009, but this doctor died, I think in 2021, I believe, and his story is incredible and very inspirational. And I thought, you know what, after Wilmington's Lie and Midnight in Chernobyl, I don't want next month's to be just another dreary, interesting, important book. I also wanted something that would maybe be uplifting and inspiring. So next month, 2 books in the review. So thank you for subscribing. Thank you, 14 people, for watching. Really appreciate it. I now have to go to church. It's a Sunday when I'm recording this, so should I go in the smoking jacket? I don't know. Bye. JL's Book Club. Remember, books, they're like documentaries for smart people.